So let's look at how companion planting is with some strategies on how we can use the defenses that plants have to help manage things in the garden. Let's see. So I wanted to just start out today. I want to talk about 3 different ways that we can add biodiversity to the garden or yard by planting a variety of plants together, which we also call companion planting. So some of the ways are adding cut flowers to the vegetable garden so that you're not only harvesting vegetables, but also blooms. You can also plant and manage cover crops. And we're going to talk about some plant partner strategies using the defense mechanisms that plants have to benefit the garden. The relationships between the specific plant partners that I'm going to mention today in this webinar have been selected from controlled research trials across various environments. So these are specific to the ones that we talk about. I don't have data on other plant partners. So these are just ones that I know of that there's been research done on. So let's first talk about what companion planting is, which is just the establishment of 2 or more plant species grown close together to either enhance growth or deter pests. So in your mind, you might be thinking, well, how close? And the answer is, it depends. Physical proximity as well as planting time varies quite a bit. And so depending on the desired results and the methodology behind the specific combinations, you're going to be doing some different things. So it can be separated by distance, it can be separated by time, it can be a succession planting. It just really depends on what your companion plants are trying to do and what you're working with. So different techniques mean different circumstances. So let's look at some of the benefits of companion planting. One thing is that you can use them to reduce pest pressure, and there's different methods that you do that, which include luring, trapping, tricking, and deterring pests to keep the vegetable garden damage to a minimum. And we'll go into that when we talk about insect pests. We also can use companion planting to reduce weed pressure. One way is called allelopathy, in which plant produces chemicals to prevent other plants from growing. And there's also something you can do called a living mulch, where plants are grown to outcompete weeds while providing other benefits. We also can reduce disease pressure because there's an interplay between the disease organisms and the plants they affect, and that can be influenced by different types of plants, companion planting strategies. So that's what we can reduce, but we can also do things that improve the environment for our our crop plants, vegetables that are desired. So one thing is you can improve soil fertility and structure by using green manures in cover crops. You can also use other plant partnerships that will, have different root depths, so they might be breaking up compaction. And then we also might be fixing nitrogen. And so we're going to be having that nitrogen transfer to improve fertility of the soil. Another thing is that companion plants, when I'm adding flowers in, I'm providing resources to increase the number and diversity of pollinators, and that can increase the yields of my fruit or any kind of thing like tomatoes or peppers or anything that we're harvesting the fruit on. We also can make that habitat for those beneficial insects and use them as biological control. And so if you have a place for them to be, those predators and those parasitoids are going to be there before the pest pressure gets really too much, and they'll be able to control it before the damage is too great. And the other thing is it can be really beautiful because most people find that mixed plantings are more attractive than monocultures. So plants have certain defenses that they use because they're not able to move around. They've had to develop some different strategies to protect themselves from being eaten by animals or infected with pathogens. And one of the ways they defend themselves from being eaten is a physical defense. So when you have thorns or sharp needles or even dense hairs on the leaves, that's one protective measure, defense mechanism that plants have. They also can make chemical compounds that makes them less palatable. And these are things that we can utilize a lot or that we stay away from, but it's things like nicotine and caffeine and cardiac glycosides and tannins, but there's thousands and thousands of these defensive chemical compounds. And so those are ways that plants defend themselves. They also can make volatile compounds that can be emitted through the air as an alarm system to attract predatory insects or to tell other plants to start making defense compounds. So that's one way that they communicate is through these volatile compounds. Plants can also alter the environment to increase their own growth or impede other plants. And so we can look at competition. Do they grow really densely? Do they grow very tall to shade out other things? Do they get really strong root systems to be able to take up more nutrients and water? When we know these things and we know that these defense mechanisms exist, then those are things that we can use in our companion planting to help reduce the pressure of some certain pests. Okay. So let's look at now that we know how they can defend themselves, how do they affect each other as they are growing together? So one thing is that there's only a limited amount of resources. So competition kind of has a negative connotation because we think, okay, they're fighting for the resources, and resources that plants fight for are light and water and nutrients. And so we all know that because that's why we take time to limit the number of weeds in our gardens to keep that competition down so that our crops, our target plants can grow. So they can grow, you can get taller plants that limit the light or that have big root systems. You also have plants that can take up nutrients and kind of move them so they can have deep roots, and they're going to move some of those nutrients that are unavailable to other plants. And so that's a way they can positively impact each other, and they can start to use you can start to use the different plants and how they grow to complement each other and provide resources. Another thing they can do is send messages, and that is through chemical means. And so they can communicate, and that can be like insects do it with pheromones, but plants do it through some things called herbivore-induced plant volatiles, and these are all called semiochemicals, and they're just signals that are released that tell the plants to grow more quickly or create compounds to inhibit the growth of neighboring plants or to avoid contact with other plants, like when you have trees and there's canopy shyness and they don't touch each other. That's that chemical messaging. We also have fungal association. So this mycorrhizal colonies, they're going to be able to increase your water and nutrient absorption, and they also can transfer nutrients from one plant to another, but they can also send those chemical messages. And the last thing that we can use is if they're creating allelopathic chemicals, which will inhibit other plants from growing. And so we'll see that those are some ways that plants can work in a shared space to change the environment. So once we know how plants work together and we know how nature is, we need to think about putting our plants in the best possible space and time for them to be as healthiest as they can be. Because if they're healthy and less stressed, then they're going to be able to withstand some of this disease and pest pressure and compete with the weeds better. So one thing is you're starting with your vegetables. Planting vegetables into their favored conditions at the right time leads to stronger, more productive plants with less pest issues. The other thing we can think about is adding a variety of flowers that will bloom from early spring to frost to keep and attract and keep nature's workers year round in the garden. And that includes pollinators and beneficial insects. Our soil is super important. And when you have a healthy soil, that is going to reduce some of the pressures of pests and disease on your plants. And so if we can add organic matter to the soil on a regular basis, we're going to build and sustain a healthier environment for our plants. The next thing is having plants that are healthy when you get started. And that's going to be really important on how they perform in your garden. And a lot of times when you get your plants, they can be stressed or root bound if you get them from a greenhouse or something. So if you can start from seed and have them started at the right time and ready to go into the ground at the right time, then they're going to thrive instead of struggle in a difficult environment. And the last thing we can do when we work with nature is provide habitat. So are we giving beneficial creatures a place to live, eat, and raise families so that they'll stay close to our garden along with their offspring and then be able to kind of keep some problems from getting too big to manage and having to resort to other means. So there's just a lot of ways that when we understand how things are working, we can do those little things to give us a little bit of an advantage. So we're going to talk about putting some flowers into your vegetable garden. And when you talk about adding cut flowers, we're going to talk about annuals today. Not that you can't use perennials, but if you are going to be rotating crops and things like that, and you have to work around perennials, it can be a little tricky. So if you just want to use annuals to get started and just it really can be a small space because most of the annuals that I'm going to share with you today are cut and come again. So the more you harvest, the more you're encouraging blooms. And even with a small space, you're going to be able to harvest a lot of bouquets. And the key is you have to harvest regularly because, like I said, the more you harvest, the more blooms will come. If you stop harvesting, they're going to set seed and then they're going to come to the end of their really thriving growth time. And when that happens, you'll be able to remove those and exchange them for something else. But you're going to be growing your own bouquets, and even a small space, you're going to find that you have lots of flowers to share because you don't want your house to start looking like a florist shop or a funeral home. So make sure you share them with your neighbors. And the real benefit is it's going to attract beneficial insects like pollinators and parasitoids and predators that are going to be able to help keep some of your problematic pests populations down. So let's look at some plants that are good for being used as annuals in a cut flowers in a garden situation. We're going to start with cool season annuals. So like I said, having plants from early spring to late fall is going to be really beneficial to keep the resources there that those beneficial insects and animals need. So we start with our cool season. They thrive in cool conditions. They can handle a bit of cold weather, so they can be planted before the last frost date, especially if they're protected and hardened off. And this gets them growing at the right time to ensure that the conditions that best suit them. What they like to do is get some really deep roots. And when you put them in the garden at the right time, they're going to be able to withstand a little bit more heat than if you planted them later in the year because they've been established. And so that's one thing you can look at for the cool season plants. Let's look at some examples. So sweet peas, snapdragons, Iceland poppy, scabiosa, and pansies are all cool season flowers that you might want to get out into your garden early in the spring, but you can also plant them as we're moving into fall because they'll be able to go through that cooler seasons of spring and fall. When we're thinking about harvesting cut flowers, you want to cut them pretty low to the ground, 3 or 4 leaves below, because that's going to encourage new long stems. And you have to kind of do some looking to find out what the flower is. Some of them will open after you harvest, some of them won't. And so you have to know when to harvest them. But this is not a talk about cut flowers production, so we won't get into that today, but some things to think about. When it starts to get warm, they'll go for a season, but then their productivity will diminish. And if we're thinking about having them as a harvestable good, we kind of have to be ruthless and say, you're not producing, I'm going to replace you with something that is. And that leads us to, as we move into summer, some warm season annuals. So these are going to thrive in hot weather. And you're going to plant them in the garden after all danger of frost has passed and the soil has warmed. And they're only going to last in your garden until the frost in the fall. They can't withstand that. So let's look at some different ones that we might be able to use in the warm season that really are heat loving. And that could be zinnias, which come in all kinds of colors. And so they're really a versatile flower. Celosia, cosmos, and sunflowers. Now, a lot of sunflowers are single stemmed, so when you cut them, they will not come back. So once those are harvested, you might want to have some seedlings ready to go if you want a long season of sunflowers, because that once they're done, they're done. So you'd have to have more ready to go if you wanted more sunflowers. And that kind of leads me to this point is succession planting. So once the productivity declines and we're out of that really the most beneficial environment for those plants, then we're going to take those out and we're going to replace them with something that's going to thrive there in the new conditions. And so if we're thinking about succession planting, you have plants that you're starting to be planted at the right time throughout the season and replacing the plants that are not being as productive. So those are some ways that you can add cut flowers into your garden to increase pollination and have resources for beneficial insects. The second type of companion planting I wanted to talk about is using cover crops. A lot of times when you think about cover crops, it's like production scale agriculture, acres and acres and acres. And so we don't always think of them for the home garden. But what they are the non-harvested crops planted either before or after harvest of vegetable crops or in fallow fields or gardens. If you have a space where you're not going to plant, you might think about a cover crop so that you're going to be protecting that soil, adding organic matter, and keeping the weeds down. While we don't plant them with our edible crops, they are a form of companion planting because they're just divided. There's the space between them is time, not actual physical space. So let's look at the benefits of cover crops are what they're. They help protect the soil from erosion and wind and water, and they renew the structure of the soil and prevent topsoil loss. They also create habitats for various species of pest-eating beneficial insects and reduce the need for chemical pest control because they're going to keep those weeds down. Some of the cover crops are legumes, and legumes fix nitrogen. It means they take the nitrogen from the air and they're going to have a relationship with the bacteria, and they're going to move that nitrogen into a form that plants can use. So when you add legumes into before or after a plant that is a heavy nitrogen user, you're going to be putting nitrogen back into that soil, so you're adding nutrients to it. So there's two different kinds of cover crops, warm season and cool season. With warm season, these are planted in spring or summer, either before a vegetable crop or in place of one in a fallow area, and they thrive in the warmer months and help the soil for the next planting season. So if you just wanted to grow like peas and lettuce, and then you don't want to grow anything else, you might think of that kind of cover crop. We also have cool season cover crops that you're going to plant in the late summer or early fall after you've harvested all of your vegetables. You don't want to worry about a fall garden. You want to put that into a cover crop. Then some of them will grow through the winter, some of them will be killed by the cold. It just depends on what you're looking for. And then you will be able to keep the weeds down there, and that will be ready to be terminated before you plant your crop in the spring. So let's look at, these are just some different cover crops that work in the garden space instead of the larger space, like buckwheat, cowpeas, oats, winter rye, crimson clover, and winter wheat. So how do you use a cover crop? Well, when you plant a cover crop, you don't need to cover the seeds. In fact, like in production ag, they can just use an airplane and fly the seeds on. And you allow the plants to grow until flowering stage. Once flowering begins, you either mow or cut them down as close to the ground as possible to prevent seed formation. If you cut them too early, then they will regrow. If you cut them too late, you might get seeds, and now you've made a weedy problem that you are trying to prevent. So once you cut them down, there's different things you can do. You can either lay them on the top as mulch, or you can till them into the ground. And when you till it into the ground, that's what they call green manure. And it depends on what your garden needs. A lot of times you can't, if you want that mulch to suppress weeds, you're just going to leave it on the top. But tilling can help incorporate organic matter into the soil. And you make the decision year by year. It doesn't mean you don't have to decide, I'm never going to till it in, or I'm going to till it in every year. You have to look at the situation. The other thing you have to think about is the rule of mow, wait, plant. So once you've terminated your cover crop, you wait for 2 to 4 weeks. If you plant into it too soon, there's a big flush of bacterial growth that happens, and that can tie up a lot of nutrients in the soil. And so you want to make sure that you've waited for that 2 to 4 weeks before you're planting into that. So the mow, wait, plant rule is really important as you're thinking about how to use your cover crop. Okay, so let's look at some plant partnerships and some ways that we can do some management of things. So we're going to start with weed management. And one way that we can use these companion planting strategies is by having living mulches. And what they are is essentially the same as a cover crop, except they're growing simultaneously instead of at different times. A lot of times they're low growing to suppress the weeds and retain soil moisture and enhance soil growth. But you want to make sure that when you're choosing a living mulch, you choose something that's not so competitive that it's going to take away from the target plant that you're trying to grow. So you have to select the right plants and use them effectively. You don't have to plant them right exactly with the plant. You can do alternate rows. You can do flanking rows where you have them on the outside and then you plant in the middle. You can plant them underneath taller plants. You can do rows and blocks. So there's lots of different ways that you can plant them alongside the crop that you're targeting. The two things you have to think about as you're doing these living mulches is competition, because you don't want something so competitive that it will take over. And you also have to make sure that you're maintaining it. It's not a plant it and forget it. You have to maintain it. And so mowing those is going to be really important. And that's where like the alternative rows or flanking rows or blocks is going to be helpful, because you want to make sure that that's not going to set seed and become a weed problem, or it's not going to take over your crop. So here's some living mulches, plant partners that they have done research on and found that there are some benefits to them growing together. One is crimson clover and cole crops. So yeah, you have to remember regular mowing to keep the clover from taking over, but crimson clover forms dense mats that suppress weeds and provide habitat for beneficial insects. And because it's a legume, the crimson clover is a legume, it's fixing nitrogen, which will be available to your cole crop. But you have to make sure you mow the clover before it sets seeds so that it doesn't become a weedy problem. Another plant partner would be red clover and winter squash. The red clover suppresses the weeds and breaks up soil, preventing compaction. It is also a legume, so it's going to fix the nitrogen, not only as it's growing, but also as it decomposes. And it keeps the soil in place, which prevents erosion. The clover is going to outgrow the weeds, but because a vining squash plant can just kind of ramble over the top of it and is not shaded, this is a good partnership. They did find the best results happen when they planted in alternating strips of clover and squash. White clover planted between the rows of strawberries or blueberries, as long as you mow the clover right before harvest. Also, they saw some yield increases and benefits to the strawberries and blueberries. And then white clover with tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers, or any other tall vegetable, because white clover has some shade tolerance, so it's good to be interplanted with vegetables, while some of the other plants can't handle that shade. You just have to remember to mow the white clover to prevent it from forming seeds. Okay. The other thing that we can think about is allelopathy. So allelopathy is where one of the plants is going to make chemicals that it is putting into the soil that is going to prohibit the growth, which could be germination or the growth of the small seedlings of other plants. And so here's some partners that you might be able to use because one of them makes allelopathic chemicals. Cucumbers with taller vegetables. So cucumbers make a allelopathic chemical that prevents the germination of other plants, even other cucumber plants. So they can be grown as a thick ground cover to prevent weeds. It's best not to do this if you're trying to start plants from seeds, because that allelopathic chemical is going to prevent that. So you don't want to plant the cucumbers where you want to start things from seeds. You would need to transplant into that. Another plant partner would be canola and potatoes. So there was a study that showed that the allelopathic chemicals released from canola is an effective way to control weeds in potatoes. But you got to make sure that you prevent the seed set in the canola so that it doesn't become a weed itself, because if you've seen where canola is grown, once it seeds, it gets everywhere. And then there's others that you can grow kind of more like a cover crop, oats and rye. They are also have the allelopathic chemicals to prevent weed seed germination. And they are really, as we think about them as cover crops, if you have terminated them and lay them down as mulch, you're going to have that allelopathic reaction that's happening, and that's going to really reduce your weed pressure. So those are some ways that we can use plant partners if we were thinking about them for weed management. Another thing that we can do is think about pest management. And when I'm talking about pests in this talk, I'm talking about insect pests. And so we know that there's some plant-eating insects that can cause problems in our gardens. And how they locate the plants that their hosts that they really want is there's different ways. They look appearance, color, size. They detect them through volatile chemicals. And so if we use these plant partnerships, we can disrupt the cues and make it more difficult for them to find and damage the crops. So one strategy is trap cropping, and this involves planting sacrificial companion plants along the vegetables. Trap crops attract the pests, drawing them away from the vegetables you want to harvest. And you have to find companion plants that are more attractive to the pest than your main crop. Some things you need to think about is to plant the trap crop a few weeks in advance of your main crop so that it is already there and they have found that and they're going to be attracted to that, and then leave your target crop alone. The other thing to think about is if the pest is highly mobile, like a Colorado potato beetle or a squash bug or a lygus bug, then you want to plant the trap crop far away from your target. But if the pest is an aphid or a mite or a whitefly or a flea beetle, then you're going to want to plant your trap crop close to the plant, because those pests are not going to be able to move to find the trap. The size of your trap crop should be only about 10 to 20% of the area of your vegetable crop, and that is based on how much of a problem you have and how mobile the pest is. Once you have them trapped and they're at this sacrificial plant, what are you going to do with them? If you don't want to use pesticides, you can use a vacuum to remove them, or you can just squash them. I think there's also where you can tap them into a bucket of soapy water. But you want to place trap crops between the garden and the wild spaces where the pests have overwintered, providing them a food source that's convenient and keep them from getting to your main crop. So that's one strategy that we can use, is trap cropping. So here's some examples. If you want a cabbage crop, you also would want to plant collards to lure the diamondback moth, as the adults prefer to lay their eggs on collards over cabbage. Another partner you could do is various squash and blue Hubbard. Blue Hubbard squash attracts squash bugs and squash vine borers. Plant the blue Hubbard on the periphery of the squash patch. 3 to 4 weeks before planting the other squash varieties, and it should draw the insects away from your target squash varieties. Another thing you can do, and that is what you see in this picture, is interplant radish near vegetables like eggplant, peppers, potatoes, and tomatoes and cole crops to lure flea beetles. The flea beetles prefer the radish, and so if you plant that 1 to 2 weeks before the other vegetable crops, they're going to go and they're going to be on the radishes. Luckily for us, they're going to be on the leaves, and we harvest the radish root, and the amount of damage that they do to the leaves on the radish is not going to diminish the yield of your radish. So it's kind of a win-win. You don't even sacrifice your plant when you have that plant partnership. Another thing that you can do is use a masking host plant, or masking the host plant by using plant combinations that produce volatile chemicals. And they can either do that or visually confuse the insects or limit the number of appropriate landings that the insects can make. So here's some examples of that. Zucchini and nasturtiums, when they grow side by side, that significantly reduces the damage to zucchini by the squash bugs. If your space is limited, think about using a bush type nasturtium. You can think about Chinese cabbage and green onions. This combination helps deter flea beetles. Tomato and basil. The basil masks the tomatoes and helps reduce thrip infestations. Collards and calendula. This combination deters aphids from feeding on the collards and attracts beneficial insects to control the aphid. And potatoes with something like tansy or catmint. This is effective against Colorado potato beetles, but when you're planting perennials like tansy and catmint with potatoes, you can get a complicated harvesting and crop rotation situation happening because you have to dig the potatoes, and that's going to disrupt your perennials. So those are some ways that we can mask the host plants with things that produce volatile chemicals. Certain companion plants also deter pests from laying eggs on your crops, like cole crops with sage, dill, chamomile, or hyssop. The herbs are going to deter the cabbage worm by masking the host plant with volatile chemicals. And cole crops with thyme, this deters the cabbage worms and cabbage loopers. And then the last thing, another thing you can do is think about putting those two ideas together, where you do a trap crop and a masking technique, and that creates a push-pull system. They are attracted to the trap crop, and they are distracted by the masking crop. And so it makes it really hard for them to find the target plant, and will go to the trap more likely because they can't find the other plant that they're looking for. So those are some ways you can think about managing insects. Another thing we can think about for companion planting is disease management. So especially if we go back to thinking about cover crops and living mulches, they are found to suppress plant populations by providing a healthy soil environment. In a healthy soil environment, we're going to be having a diverse variety of microorganisms, and they're going to compete with the pathogens. And then the pathogens are not going to be able to increase their population really quickly and not be able to really infest the plant and make a disease because of that competition. They can also create a physical barrier to prevent splash up, which allows bacterial pathogens to come in contact with the host and infect it. And they can make it so that insects that carry pathogens find it more difficult to find their target crop. So there's some partners that we could put together. Potatoes and oats or winter rye is found to reduce verticillium wilt on potatoes. Potatoes with brassicas for potato scab, cauliflower and lettuce with brassicas for verticillium wilt and sclerotinia, stem rot, tomatoes, and hairy vetch for managing foliar disease. So there's lots of different partners that can work together to really build up the health of the soil and prevent pathogens from building up and being able to infect your plants. When we have this healthy ecosystem, then biological control is going to be more realistic because the animals, the other insects, you're going to also be inviting things like birds and amphibians and all kinds of things into this area when you where you have the habitat. You're going to be able to use them to help you control some of the problems. One thing you can think about is using a banker plant, and this is just another one of those sacrificial companion plants that serves as a host for pests, providing beneficial insects with a continuous supply of prey when the vegetable plants met for harvest are pest free. So one thing you could do is just plant extra tomatoes that you're not going to harvest. And then when you find like a hornworm, you can put them on that plant. That's one thing you can do because then you'll have the moth that's a pollinator. But here's some plant partners that work. Lettuce and other greens with dill and fennel for aphid control, eggplants and dill or cilantro to control Colorado potato beetle, cole crops and black-eyed Susans and cosmos for aphid control, various vegetables and carrots and mints, family herbs to control caterpillar pests, lettuce or grapes with sweet alyssum for aphid control. And so there's just a lot of different partners that are going to help give you the predators and parasitoids and animals that will help you control some of those pest insects. Another thing we can think about is pollination. So the greater diversity of pollinators you have in your garden, the more likely you are to get a high pollination rate. And that's going to increase your yield. For example, bumblebees are buzz pollinators, and things like tomatoes and peppers and eggplants need that buzz pollination. It encourages them to drop their pollen. If you have bumblebees there, from all throughout the season, then this pollination rate is going to go up. And so in Michigan, they did a study and they found that the blueberries pollination rate was greatly improved when it was interplanted with crimson clover because that crimson clover was available to get the bumblebees there throughout the whole season, ready to pollinate those blueberries when the time was right. The best way to attract specialist squash bees to pollinate squash is to have more squash. So when you are thinking of planting more squash to get all that pollination, more squash is better as we're thinking about the bees. Also thinking about no-till gardening is going to protect the nests and the life cycle of some of our native pollinators. And then if we have flowering herbs and annuals, we're going to attract sweat bees, which pollinate a large number of fruit and vegetables. So there's lots of different partners that we can use to increase pollination. And as we're talking about native bees, we want to support them. Not that it's not important to support honeybees too, but we have a large variety and diversity of the native bees. And so as we're thinking about diversifying and each thing having its own place where it's going to fit, then having a variety of pollinators is going to be beneficial. So we can make sure we have those resources of pollen and nectar from early spring to late fall, leaving perennial stems and tree leaves on the ground for overwintering, and being smart about our garden cleanup, eliminating pesticides, and leaving some space, some bare ground, that's space for nesting. So that leads us to this, which is overall, when we talk about companion planting, what we're really talking about is increasing biodiversity in your garden. Having a variety of colors, aromas, and ripening times can confuse pests, reducing their ability to cause damage to one particular crop. Using plant defenses and growth habits to your advantage is one way to keep unwanted weeds from taking over a garden space. A biodiverse garden is a way to have healthy plants for you to harvest. You can view past recordings of 4-season webinars on YouTube at the University of Illinois Extension Horticulture YouTube page. And then we have a brief survey that you can use the website or the QR code to go to.